Hi. So this video is in place of what would usually be either your Being Bold Club lesson if you're in year 8, or if you're in year 9, your classics or Latin lesson. And we're going to continue to look at ancient Greek myths like we have been doing for the last few weeks. In particular, we're going to focus today on the myths surrounding Medusa, but also think about how we might reinterpret those today, and indeed how the myths surrounding Medusa have already been reinterpreted in modern times by modern thinkers. The first job is to read the myth. Pause the video here and read the myths on the page. Once you've read them, you can go ahead and read the keywords and definitions, because they're going to be really important actually in this lesson. Pause the video, read the keywords and definitions. All right, now that you have done that, you're actually just about to watch a video that's been recorded by Ben, the classicist, the classical history expert who's been working with us to produce these resources. And it's all about how Medusa has been interpreted since ancient Greek times up to today. What I need you to think about initially, what do you think about what Ben is saying? And there are some questions to maybe stimulate some thoughts on the screen. Is how Medusa has been portrayed or shown fair? How might she be portrayed or shown differently? And how could modern feminists maybe reclaim the story of Medusa? You need to record your thoughts in the box.
Ask anyone, and they're likely to tell you one of two things about Medusa. She has snakes for hair, and she has the power to turn people to stone just by looking at them. Her image is infamous and her reputation well established, but few people know or care to know her story. Our perceptions of Medusa seem wholly negative. We recognise her as dangerous, evil, treacherous, ugly. Depictions on screen characterise her as a monstrous half-woman, half-snake creature who terrorises the ancient world and who needs to be defeated by a hero. The ancient Greeks, whose society was patriarchal, created and perpetuated this belief, but Medusa's story contains more nuance, which means Medusa is more than merely a monster. Perhaps this is why groups throughout history, themselves misunderstood or threatened, have adopted her as their symbol. After all, that's one of the things she was to the ancient Greeks, a symbol. The name Medusa comes from the Greek verb medor, which means I protect, and her image was considered a powerful piece of apotropaic magic designed to turn away evil spirits. The ancient Greeks, and the Romans too, would display Medusa's head on temples and in the entranceways to their homes to protect them from bad luck and evil spirits, much like gargoyles and hunky-punks on churches, amulets of the evil eye, and even carved pumpkins at Halloween. Yet this aspect of Medusa's history remains less familiar, and she persists as this villainous, wretched beast woman. Why? Well, first, let's explore her mythological origins. Medusa is most famous for her beheading at the hands of the hero Perseus. He used divine gifts from Athena and Hermes, along with his own skill and cunning, to capture her head, which from that moment became a terrible symbol of dread and fear, displayed proudly on the shields of the goddess Athena and King Agamemnon during the Trojan War, and used as a weapon to petrify one's enemies. Petrify literally means to turn something to stone, from the Latin words petra, rock, and the verb facere, to make. Back to Medusa. Many people don't know that she was once a mortal woman, renowned for her loveliness. One day, as she prayed at Athena's shrine in the temple, Lord Poseidon, god of the sea, raped her. This invited the wrath of the goddess Athena, who, surprisingly, punished Medusa for the desecration of her temple. The goddess turned Medusa's beautiful hair into vicious snakes. Medusa was the victim, a passive figure, yet she ended up the one punished. Later, in the Perseus myth, she is slain by the hero. But Medusa did nothing to provoke Perseus. She was, in fact, asleep at the time of her murder. For centuries, artists have taken inspiration from Medusa. She features in mosaics, like this one depicting Alexander the Great. She's there in the centre of his armour. And also these found in Britain and Tunisia. She also features on paintings, like this one by Caravaggio, and countless sculptures, the most famous of which is this by Cellini, which is bluntly titled Perseus with the Head of Medusa. Now, in each of these depictions, she is just a head. Perhaps that's because her power is in her head, and that power is harnessed and wielded by others after it's separated from her body. Many have interpreted this as a vehicle for male control over women. By transforming her into something ornamental and useful, Medusa remains subservient. Her individualism is neutralised and her threat is contained. Medusa is the metaphor often used for women in power. During her time as Home Secretary, former Prime Minister Theresa May was called the Medusa of Maidenhead, only for the Daily Express then to quip that the comparison might be a bit strong. We all know that Mrs May has beautifully coiffed hair. Again, it comes back to appearance, the woman as an ornament, something to be admired, but not taken seriously in a man's world. Critics of the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, superimposed her head on Caravaggio's portrait. And supporters of Donald Trump reimagined Cellini's statue in the aftermath of his 2016 election victory. Trump is Perseus, and Hillary Clinton, his competitor in the race for the White House, is Medusa. The implications are clear. Professor Elizabeth Johnston says, in Western culture, strong women have historically been imagined as threats requiring male conquest and control, and Medusa has been the go-to figure for those seeking to demonise female authority. Yet there are those who seek to reclaim Medusa as protector, those who realise that because her appearance is her power, it should be harnessed. Left-wing groups in post-revolution France, radical political figures in Britain, feminists and victims of rape and sexual assault have long utilised Medusa as their champion, subverting the common misconception of her as evil, identifying instead with her as a fellow victim of tyranny and oppression whose suffering became power. The poet Shelley refers to the tempestuous loveliness of terror when describing her, and this oxymoron is fitting for a character whose complexity has endured centuries of interpretation, misinterpretation, and reinterpretation. Everyone knows Medusa. Few so readily recall Perseus as the man who killed her, yet it is this male-centric view of Medusa which remains. Her myth serves as an important reminder for us. In our age of ever-present media, instant updates and fake news, we as responsible citizens need to ask ourselves who is telling the story, why are they telling it, and what do they think about it, so we can establish an opinion and a perspective for ourselves. The person telling the story has power and influence to shape the narrative to suit their purpose. Well, everyone telling a story has an agenda, but everyone has a voice, and therefore a right to be heard. Medusa's voice is never heard, but her legacy speaks volumes.
So you're actually going to watch another recording now. This time, Ben and Miss Rinich having a discussion about how Medusa again has been interpreted since Greek times. What I need you to do, again, is record your thoughts in the box. You're going to start by thinking about the same questions as you just did above, but also think about the two new ones on the screen. Might Medusa have been misinterpreted? And how might we go about changing this today?
Right, so where were we?
We were discussing subverting stereotypes, weren't we?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about the perception and whether or not that is the reality.
Mm-hmm.
And with Medusa, so often people will recognize that she's ugly, she's evil, and she's this sort of very negative force.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody really understands or even seeks to question how she got that way in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
It's just accepted that she is a monster, she needs to be defeated. So Perseus, the valiant hero, comes in, slices her head off, and saves the day.
Mm-hmm.
But as we've seen in our sort of reading of the myth, the day didn't need saving in the first place.
No.
She wasn't a threat to the hero, but if you ask anybody who has even a sort of passing familiarity with Medusa, she is a monster.
Mm-hmm.
And what question I wanted to ask really is why do you think men so often demonize attractive women? What's the threat that comes from a woman, do you think?
I think in terms of literature and certainly in life as well, I feel as though the threat comes from the vulnerability. I think it's more about a person's vulnerability when it's matters of the heart. And I think very stereotypically, you know, we have a lot of these stories where a man sees a woman and then all of a sudden they almost get jelly legs. And it's that vulnerability that a woman's physicality causes to a man. And I think that is where the initial threat comes from.
Yes,
exactly. And we can't see heroes as having a weakness. And I feel as though, especially with Medusa, because she was this beautiful being prior to what happened with Perseus, or not Perseus, sorry, it's Poseidon, isn't it, that first comes, and that is, you know, it's dealing with that threat. That is what Poseidon is doing. That is how he can kind of maintain his hero status. He can't have that weakness, that temptation there that's going to distract him from everything else that he's doing. And so if she is then turned into a being that is ugly, the fear is her as a monster. It's not the fear that she's going to cause vulnerability in him as a hero.
Yeah, and I think that's the fascinating thing, is because nobody really acknowledges that that the woman has power because she's now under the control of the man, isn't she? It's as though, oh, you know, the hero is displaying his heroic qualities in subjugating the woman. It's as though, you know, she's just falling into her natural place, because how could she resist the heroic advances of Perseus, or even the divine advances of Poseidon? Who is she, a mortal, to contend with this god? And what also I think is interesting, based on that myth, is the idea that Athena punishes her, doesn't she? It's not as though Poseidon is the one who transgresses. He's the one committing the assault. And yet it's, oh no, Medusa, I'm punishing you because you've desecrated my temple. How could you do such a thing in this holy place? And do you think that's why victims so readily accept her as their sort of protecting symbol?
I think so. I mean, back to the Athena thing, I think if we look at other stories in Greek myth, like the one with Paris, where there's that wedding and then there's the golden apple. And so Athena and Who else was it? You'll have to remind me.
Aphrodite
Yes.
and Hera.
Yes. And all three of them are competing for this apple that claims to be for the most beautiful.
Yes.
And I think this is also a really common thing that happens to women and in society, and this kind of patriarchal unwritten rule is that not only do women kind of possess something that allows a man to feel vulnerable, I think that women often see each other as competition when we don't necessarily want to. It's almost become ingrained in who we are. And so I think when Athena then punishes Medusa as a result of what happened with Poseidon, I think that that is more out of that, okay, she has possessed something that has caused this man to feel vulnerable, and therefore as competition almost, this is how I can deal with this situation, rather than necessarily siding with the woman. And I do feel like that is kind of, although it is Greek myth and we can see it for what it is, I do think it's reflective of that horrible innate relationship that women have with one another, as well as how we have this stereotype of women's beauty and women's looks do cause that vulnerability with men. And so I think that she is kind of a beacon of like a symbol to victims, purely because it is representative of those horrors that we face naturally in society today. And because she is the one that is suffering, and we are able to look at it through our own lenses and how we are now as a society, we see her as, okay, this woman has been through this, we understand this, and we are as society and as readers going to be the ones that are siding with her now. And so I think society has changed, and that's why opinions and feelings towards Medusa has changed as well. Whereas now, as time has moved on, different movements have happened, different adaptations and literature has come out, we've had more conversations about it, we can approach these stories and see characters such as Medusa as that icon.
And I think one of the most interesting things about Medusa's depiction in art throughout human history since she's been in existence for the last, I don't know, 2,500 years, maybe back to ancient Greece, in the depictions on mosaics and pots, and through Renaissance art and other bits and pieces into modern times. She's always shown as just a head.
Yeah, she's never shown as her whole body.
Exactly, she's very rarely sort of a head attached to a body. And I don't know, what do you think that says about male control over women, that she is something that's incomplete, that she's just, you know, a head on its own?
Because I think if we look back at the story, you know, and we consider what we were talking about at the start of this discussion about the potential of vulnerability that could cause on a hero as a result of desire, temptation, I think that is kind of setting the premise, isn't it? It's, you know, this is Medusa. Medusa is the Gorgon. This is her head, and this is her hair full of snakes. She is not a woman. She does not possess all of those natural attributes of a woman.
Absolutely.
And so through not placing that on her and showing just her head, it's already that in itself is cutting off that desirability of her and stopping that potential vulnerability as a result.
Because now and then she becomes a trophy, doesn't she? It's like, look what I've won. Look how I've conquered her, because this is sort of proof positive that I am who I say I am. I am the hero because, behold, Medusa's head.
All right. It's time now that we looked at a modern reinterpretation of the myths surrounding Medusa. You're going to read a poem written by modern poet Carol Ann Duffy entitled Medusa. It's her attempt to reclaim the story for women. Read the poem, and just for the time being, consider what you think of it. What does it say to you? What does it make you think about Medusa? Pause the video, read the poem. All right. You're going to watch the second half now of Miss Rinich and Ben's discussion. This time, they're considering different lenses, how we might reinterpret Medusa and the myth surrounding her.
The myth, as it would have done back then, would change to suit its surroundings, because everybody had their own degree of flexibility with the myth. If you wanted to tell it, put a particular spin on it for a particular region or a particular situation, you as the storyteller had the freedom to do that. And I think what you said about lenses is really, really interesting. And it's also interesting to think how one group's desire to assert their identity and sort of bring themselves up on par with the rest of society gives other marginalized groups the courage to strive for their own advancements and their own sort of recognition. What is it about lenses you think sort of is so important when it comes to claiming a story in a way?
Because I think every human being has had different experiences throughout their lives. Every human being has different beliefs and priorities that make them who they are. And so whenever we're looking at traditional stories, we are looking at them as a base. But then our thoughts and the way that we have read it as a reader, and we do this a lot in school as well, especially when we're writing our essays for at the moment Year 9 of studying Jane Eyre. Different people have different opinions on different things that have happened throughout the novel. And so when you're writing about what a reader believes, you have to tap into what you think and what you believe. But that's not going to be the same for every single reader. So when I'm saying lenses, it's like you've got the base layer of the story, you've got the story in front of you, but depending on who you are as a person, the way that you have then looked at that story is very different to the way someone else might have looked at it. Like, for example, a teacher is going to look at, an English teacher is going to look at a piece of marking completely differently to a maths teacher.
Yes.
If I was to put an essay on Jane Eyre in front of a maths teacher, they would be looking for different things.
Yeah.
Right? And it
Absolutely.
it's exactly the same way. And so when we're faced with Greek myth, okay, and we were actually having this discussion, one of my classes already said they recognized the photo of Medusa on the screen and they gave their own story of Medusa that they have heard of and their personal interpretation of it. But then another student said, well, didn't this happen? Is this not what it's about? And so already you've got different students and different people hearing similar stories, but obviously based on who they are and what gender they were as well was very important.
Absolutely, and it will be.
Then they had very different opinions of that story.
Because you're likely to identify perhaps more with one than the other.
Yes.
Based on, like you said, based on personal experience, based on all these other influences you've been exposed to. And I think it's really interesting to consider how even in that classroom setting, the two different students are recognizing the wonderful adaptability and flexibility of these stories. The base is there, and then you craft it and shape it to fit your purpose. And I think we're starting to see that, especially in the study of the classical world. We're starting to see so many more publications of fiction trying to imagine what the women of that time were going through in these famous stories. So many authors. One which comes to mind especially is Margaret Atwood.
Yes.
And she has a book called the Penelopiad.
Yeah, I've got it actually. I borrowed it the other day.
She's the famous story is of the heroic Greek general Odysseus, who was instrumental in the planning of the Trojan horse to overthrow Troy. Homer wrote 24-book epic poem about his trials and tribulations returning from Troy back to his home on the Greek island of Ithaca. And he goes through all these tests and all this adversity. He fights the Cyclops, he fights these giants, he has to go to the underworld. all the while his wife is back at home trying to keep these suitors at bay who want to marry her in his stead, because they don't know if he's survived, they don't know if he's coming back. Well, Margaret Atwood approaches it and thinks, well, what's Penelope going through during this time? How does she view this whole situation?
Mm-hmm.
And for a character who's so essential to the story, you know, Odysseus' whole motivation is, I have to get back to her. And we've seen it, like we said, with the Medusa story, with the Trojan War story, because the whole Trojan War starts because of a woman, Helen,
Mm-hmm.
And the apple of discord, and it all ties in together.
Yeah.
This situation with Penelope, the women play such prominent roles, yet it's always as an object of male desire, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to any sort of individual sense of identity they might possess themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's no wonder we've had such strong sort of set views of what the woman should do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no wonder we see the sort of the continued demonization of atypical women in media, whether it's female leaders, female celebrities, any of these very sort of limited interpretations of what you should or shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, you know, I'm sure it can be quite damaging to see things in such a restricted way. And I think what's interesting from what you were saying before about this idea of what you bring to your viewing when you're seeing these things, like with Lady Macbeth, the audience in the Jacobean era would see Lady Macbeth as shocking and sort of completely out of her mind to be challenging her husband and doing such things. But in 2020 audience, it's like, well, what's wrong with her telling her husband how things should be? What's wrong with her asserting her own opinions?
Mm-hmm.
And sort of a 400-year gap. The text doesn't change, does it? The story is exactly the same. The material on the page is exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
But the attitudes that have developed since really inform the audience's perception of what is going on the page. So perhaps she's not as shocking. And in the same way with Medusa, perhaps with a bit more understanding of maybe even what she's been through, maybe a bit more of an empathetic response, maybe she's not so terrifying.
I mean, I certainly believe so. I think, but this is exactly what you're saying. The text hasn't changed. The story in its original form has not changed. It's society that's changed and the way we're looking at the story that's different.
And I think the more we can do as a society to challenge these preconceived notions, hopefully the easier it will be for us to relate to people who don't look like us, or don't think like us, or don't hold the same sort of, value system or belief system.
Next job then is part C, as you can see on the screen. There are a series of questions running down alongside that poem. What I need you to do is just write an answer to each of those questions. Pause the video here, answer each of those questions. Should take you about 6 to 8 minutes. Pause the video, answer the questions. All right, once you've done that, we need to now compare those two interpretations of Medusa that we've considered. The original myth on page 1 and Carol Ann Duffy's poem that you have just read about Medusa. What do you think are the differences between them? Note them or note down your ideas in the box. Should take you about 2 to 3 minutes. Pause the video, do that now. All right, 2 more jobs next. Or 2 more jobs left, even, I should say. Question 6. There are a choice there of 4 questions that I need you to answer. You're only going to answer one of those questions, and the choice is yours. Read the questions and circle the one that you are going to answer now. All right. Once you've selected which question you are going to answer it in the box. Should take you 2 to 3 minutes. Pause the video, answer that question now. Excellent. Last task. As you can see, as it says, you're going to rewrite next week the Perseus and Medusa myth from different perspectives, from different lenses. You need to plan your story now ahead of time in the box below. And you might want to remember that story triangle that we've spoken about before, with setting the scene, rising actions, climactic events, falling actions, and the endings there. Because that's a really good model for us to think about, as we know whenever we're writing a story centered around an ancient Greek myth. So use the rest of the time this lesson to plan your story or your retelling of the Medusa myths for next week's lesson.